Well, welcome back once again to Talking with Tech. My name's Lucas Stuber, joined as always by Rachel Madel. How are you?
I'm doing so good. How are you?
Good. I'm hiding in a closet because the acoustics in my house are not great. And by Chris Begay, also in a closet. How are you?
No, I'm fantastic.
Well, so today we're going to talk about iconicity. What's critical about it is that it's a fundamental underlying piece of what we're doing in AAC that we talk a lot less about than we do about language systems and grid sizes and everything else, but it underpins everything else. Chris, did you have thoughts on that?
Quick, don't turn off the podcast when you hear that word iconicity. We're going to try and break it down for you. So iconicity, the way I think of it is, here's a picture. How well does that picture do representing what I was trying to represent? I just saw a tweet by someone who made a World Cup board with all these icons on it, and it is in Croatian, right? So the text over each of the picture symbols is in a language that I don't speak. And so I'm looking at these pictures and I'm thinking, do I know what this word is? You know, what is this thing trying to make? And it looks like it's board maker symbol-ish, you know? There's a clear one here where there's a soccer ball going into a goal. Well, that's pretty simple. I know that is going to be goal. But then there's another one here where it's just like people with their arms up, shaking their hands in the air. And it's got me thinking, does that mean cheer, hooray? Like, I don't know what that picture means. And so that's what I think iconicity means, is how well does a picture represent what it's supposed to represent? And
this is relevant, I think, to everyone's practice, because all of the different systems that we use in AAC have different sort of approaches to this and different levels of iconicity, whether that's PCS symbols or symbol sticks or lesson picks or Smarty symbols or whatever it happens to be that's been licensed or created for that specific AAC system. And it has real implications for the users, you know, especially as we're finding through research for users with autism, right? Rachel, this is an area that you work with a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was so excited. So I have been following who we did the interview with, Calum Hartley, and he is doing research on iconicity and specific to children with autism. And I found his research because I have had a lot of roadblocks when it comes to the children that I work with who have autism understanding photos and pictures. And so I was really fascinated by his research. And of course, I was thrilled to see that he would come on the show and talk with us. So I'm really excited for you guys to hear the interview. It was a really fantastic conversation that he talks about his research and how children with autism, you know, are understanding symbols a little bit differently than maybe some of our other clients, and really interested in how that impacts our AAC implementation, obviously.
So let's talk, I guess, a little bit briefly about the just sort of scales of iconicity, just in terms of how iconic things are, right? So the most literal sort of non-abstract representation of something would actually be a photograph, right, relative to the actual thing itself. So if you have a dog, right, you take a picture of that student's dog, then they have a photo of the dog in the device and they know what that means, right? I mean, that's something that I think is probably the most concrete, understandable icon.
Maybe, if that's the word you're trying to represent. Is it canine? Is it bark? Is it furry? What word are you really trying to have the person understand? You know, that I think is kind of the heart of the issue.
Right, absolutely. Well, and that's one advantage, right, of things that are maybe less iconic. So if we were to go up a couple levels, maybe to a line drawing with color or just a line drawing, or eventually to the ultimate sort of level of abstraction visually, which would be letters to form language, that can apply, like, the photograph of a dog refers to that dog specifically, but a line drawing of a resemblance of a dog could be the total genus of dogs, or it could be canine, right, or a variety of other things. So it allows us to represent more things the more abstract we get, but we have to balance that against the sort of literal interpretation of the world that some of our clients might experience. So let's talk about some of the ways that impacts practice. Rachel, you made some comments about that. What are the ways that you would modify then the icons if you're hitting a roadblock with a student with autism?
You hit the nail on the head, Lucas, when you hit a roadblock. So I always start with icons because I always want to assume that a child can pick them up and understand them. But what I find sometimes is when children aren't being as consistent with their device, or it just feels like it's not clicking, I will try to use a photograph instead of the icon and see if that helps. A lot of times, that switch is enough for it to click for a child, especially a child with autism. I was working with a client a few months ago, and parents felt like they're not getting it. We don't know what to do. It just feels random. And they weren't navigating consistently to the different folders. And so inside the fringe word folders were fringe words, and we could take photos of, banana and cookie and all the things that they wanted to ask for. But when it came to navigating the folders, they had a hard time. And I realized that there was an icon on each of the folders for food, right? It's a collection of things. So it's easier to have an icon for food. But what I decided to do was I went on Google Images and I pulled an image of a variety of different kinds of food. So I tried to find the best photograph versions of food and toys and places. And I changed the symbols to photographs on the device, and almost instantaneously, this child was able to then navigate, which was interesting and which told me that it was the icon that they weren't understanding. Now, with that being said, I think sometimes we just need to give it more time, right? I think eventually if we modeled enough, the child would either learn the icon or they would understand the motor plan. This is where all my food is. Doesn't mean they necessarily have to look at the symbol. But I do think that for kids who are having a hard time, it's something that you can try to make it easier for them.
Yeah, Rachel, I have a quick follow-up question for you. When you said you changed the icons, do you mean you changed the icon for the category of food, or did you change all of the icons for each individual food? This is a banana, this is an apple, this is a...
So we had started with photographs in the folders. So for the food folder, there were photographs in there for a lot of the different foods, because mom was like, well, I don't know what kind of cookie he wants. And mom was very specific about wanting the different kinds of food. So she was taking photographs of everything. So he was having success with the photographs. But yes, I changed the icon of the food folder to just a Google image photograph of food. And it helped exponentially with this specific case.
Maybe using the Google images is a way of teaching what the symbol means, and those could work in simpatico together,
Right.
So use this to teach that.
That's a really good point. It can be a fallback, right? So if we need to go to pictures or even like a visual scene display, like that can really give some concrete meaning to this device for a lot of kids. But it's restrictive, right? Because then that limits the context in which it's usable. Like if you have a bunch of visual scenes around the house, then you're not going to be able to use that as effectively when you go out to Costco, right? However, we don't want to get stuck there, I guess. Like we want to keep on reinforcing the meaning of that and trying to graduate back to things that are a little bit more abstract, because that's ultimately how we get to literacy, which is the end goal, right? We want people to be understanding the symbols that, formulate language.
And that's always the caveat for me, and this is what I told the family. I said, we're going to change it for now. First and foremost, I want them to have success with their device, because especially in the initial stages of AAC, you need that buy-in.
Right.
So I need my client to be like, yes, this is easy. I'm getting what I want. I can navigate it. But I think you're exactly right, Lucas. We need to remember to teach those things. We can't just take photographs of every word we would want a child to use on a device. And especially as words become more abstract, we rely on those icons. How do we photograph more, for example? It's really challenging. So we need to teach that skill. And that's something that actually, when I work with ABA teams, we do run programming on how to teach icons. And we do things like icon sorting, having all different kinds of cookies, and we put them all in one place. But it has the icon on that sorting page. And then eventually understanding that, I match this photograph of an Oreo with the icon for cookie because they're the same thing. So, but it's something that I'm really cognizant of when I'm working with a family and a team, is that I want to keep teaching that. We don't have enough space on these devices without multiple levels of navigation to get to all of those photographs of all of the potential snacks and foods and toys and all the things that they could want.
Well, and one sort of underlying theme to all of this, with the fact that you start with icons and then fall back if you need to, is this idea of the presumption of competence, right? And one thing I thought was really interesting with Calum's research, which he'll talk about a little bit, is the fact that symbolic knowledge does not seem to be correlated at all with measures of nonverbal IQ. that this is much more predicted by measures of language knowledge, right? Meaning that we can make inferences that way. Like, so if we have a child with a strong grasp of symbolic meaning, then that probably translates just about one-to-one to access to language. With ASD, this particularly seems to be the case.
Great point. It's so hard for these kids who come to us for AAC, right? Because communication is so challenging. Any assessment is always going to have to be taken with a grain of salt. I mean, I think any assessment generally, just because it's one glimpse of a child, but especially our AAC kids, because it's just really challenging when there's a lack of understanding of what they even know. A lot of the kids that I work with, it's really hard to just judge their receptive language because they can't show me everything, right? If it's a noun, sure, it's easier, but the more abstract it becomes, the harder it is, right? They can't answer questions. They can't do a lot of the things that are judges for receptive language.
And what's more abstract, Rachel, than core vocabulary? You know, you ask someone to show me a picture of put, draw me a picture of put. Well, what do you draw? Draw me a picture of get, what do you draw? And, so often we fool ourselves because there's like that, just like I said, with the Croatian little icons that I was looking at, don't speak Croatian. I don't read Croatian. I don't know what that icon means. Just like most kids who are using AAC devices are not yet literate. They're not reading. But we, because the adults are with them, we assume, well, you should know what that means put. You should know what that means get. I often think maybe the best icon would be, imagine taking go into a kindergarten classroom, or maybe 5 kindergarten classrooms, and ask them to draw me a picture of put, and have them all draw it, and then then use that as the icon, which somehow gets some sort of a assimilation of all of those. It's like, look, they all drew this because let's put that on the communication symbol, because then that would match the developmental age.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, I wonder if the people who are coming up with these symbols have done their research, right? Their preschool research.
We should just have a little team of preschool artists, actually. We basically have Batman for everything.
You know what's interesting, actually, that I thought of, Chris, as you were just saying that, is what I've done before to impress upon teams how hard it is to adopt a system, an AAC system, is I will take the labels off. So it's only icons. Right. And it's like, now navigate it. Now figure out everything, because we take for granted the fact that we're literate and we can read. Just like you said, Chris, it says put under it. So we're like, oh, put. Yeah, this makes sense. Take all those labels off and all of those words, and it's a lot more challenging. And I think it's a good practice for us to try to get into the shoes of our learners and realize that this is challenging. And if we didn't read, it would be a lot harder to decipher what those icons mean.
I get nervous sometimes that people choose their systems. And I've definitely heard parents and teachers say, well, part of the consideration was the symbols that we liked better. Like you liked better? Like, what do you mean you liked it? Like, because you looked at it and it made more sense to you. But maybe there's something to that. But again, you take those words off and you don't know what they are. That'd be a better way to assess what symbol set makes most sense to you. I think another part of that iconicity piece is that, again, here's another big word, polysemy.
Polysemy, yes.
Polysemy, that's it. Thanks, Lucas. Right? The idea that the icon could have more than one meaning. So if it's a lion, it could mean yellow. It could mean terror. It could mean hungry. If it was an elephant, it means large. It could mean big, huge, slower. If it was Dumbo, it could be flying elephants. I don't know. But you know what I mean? Like a picture of an elephant can mean more than just one thing.
Yeah, and in fact, it does. I try to remember the name of the icon system, but it's used for big, or perhaps it's bigger. That's and it's a double-edged sword, right? Because on the one hand, that provides a lot more potential meaning and versatility within the system, right, by allowing for polysemy. But it also is a little bit more complicated in terms of iconic meaning. That's one of a number of approaches I think that people have taken to embed more meaning into systems with the inherent restrictions that we have in terms of like grid size and those things. Another one, Chris, that I know you mentioned when we were talking about a different topic is, having, and maybe you can explain this better, but having a sequence of icons to construct meaning instead of a single one.
if you have an abstract word like open or put or work or something like that, if you had multiple images, you could maybe better have a chance of guessing what that word was. So if I had a picture of an open door and a picture of an open jar and a picture of my arms wide open, those three put together would be better than just any one of those to being able to guess, well, it's not door because there's a picture of a jar there, and it's not jar because there's a picture of a door there. Is it hug because Chris's arms are out? No, that doesn't fit with it. But they're all three of those are open. It's the word we're going for is open. So if you had some sort of multiple icons to represent a word, you might better be able to represent that word, which I think some systems are built that way. Specifically, I think Words for Life is built that way. The MinSpeak is the Unity system is built that way, and I think Speak for Yourself is based on that.
Yep. Well, and then another approach I've seen a few people take is to have animated icons, right? To have a little bit more of that sort of verb sense to it, you know? And I don't know about that. I guess we don't really have research yet. In my experience, when I've tried that with certain students, especially on the spectrum, it's been very distracting. But it's an intriguing idea.
Well, you know what? It's because you have all these symbols together, right? So if you're looking at just one symbol and it's a little ball going in and out and in and out, you could have it be in and out, you know? But of course, then that's two. But you now picture an entire grid with all these moving symbols, you know?
Yeah, it's like watching a bunch of cartoons at once.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe a little more difficult.
Well, and what's interesting, and I'm not exactly sure the name of this guy who's doing research in Boston, but what they were doing with kids with autism was doing video modeling of actions and then doing a screen grab from the video. So teaching, you know, jump, for example, having the child jump, taking a video of it, and then pulling that screenshot from and using it as a still frame in the device. And we're having success with that, which I thought was really interesting, just because I think you're right. I think the dynamic images, like we have, our learners often have enough challenges attending and, you know, staying focused and not getting distracted. And I think we don't need to add, you know, moving images. Like I can just imagine all of my kids, like little heads, like bobbing all around, like, you know, super distracted. So, but it's really interesting just to kind of think about, because I think that, you know, as technology grows, we have a lot of opportunities to figure out what ways might work better, especially for specific kinds of learners.
So what do you think our takeaways are?
Well, I think one of them is how can we teach kids who are having a hard time with iconicity? What strategies or, you know, ideas can we share with teachers and SLPs to start working on this if the child is not grasping iconicity? Do you guys have any ideas?
Well, my first thought is to make sure that you're not imposing that on them, meaning I wouldn't want to say, geez, the kid's having a hard time with iconicity because they don't understand what the word put is, or they don't understand what the word sit is, or this abstract symbol. I think what I would do is I'd want to be teaching what that icon is. And I want to make sure that I've taught it to the point where they've proven to me that they can't learn it. And then I would go back and see, well, maybe I would switch the icon at that point. But first I would be really wanting to be teaching what the icon means. And so to put it to your example of the screen grab of the jump, I think immediately I'd be like, okay, let's watch these videos of kids jumping and you jump and everyone in the class jump. And then here's the icon for jump, you know, or do that simultaneously. I'm showing you a picture of jumping and here's the icon for jump so that you're teaching what that icon means. So I think that's one of my big takeaways.
Yeah, I mean, I think another one is, Rachel, you already described it, but not, I guess, I love what you just said, Chris, about teaching it until they sort of prove that they're not going to learn it in the manner that it's being presented, right? So obviously always start at the, you know, the highest level that you think is appropriate based on all the knowledge that you have about that child. But, you know, we can also fall back to more concrete representations, especially in situations where motivation can be a factor. Right. You know, I mean, if you're in building that initial buy-in around the device, the last thing you want is for it sort of not to be understood to the level of frustration and then have the student just not want to engage with it anymore.
Well, and something that I do, speaking to motivation, Lucas, is once we kind of start getting that buy-in and the child's using the device, I'll start integrating symbols for their highly preferred items. Right? So if they love cookies, like that's one of the first ones I switch over to see, like, okay, I know they probably know where it is because they've had so much exposure with it. Can we switch this to an icon? And 9 times out of 10, we can, probably because they know where the motor plan for it. And they know, like, I know where a cookie is. You could change it to pretty much anything and I'll still know where a cookie is. So I think that's important, is taking into consideration the motivation. And for highly motivating words, I think is a good place to start.
Yeah, perfect. And as you say, exactly, once they've already sort of learned the location and that, I mean, if you change that, they're going to keep on accessing it in the same manner. And that's a good way to scaffold some of the other learning. And then the other piece is just sort of best practices for leading into literacy. I just want to say this, even though we haven't really hit on it too much, but do please keep that text paired with the icon on the device. Thank you very much, and always have that there. It's just having that sort of passive exposure to the letters that represent the words is really important. And then over time, we can gradually sort of fade away even the size of the icons and those sorts of things and start focusing more on the letters.
I think one other big takeaway would be looking at the assessment piece. And when you're considering what communication system to put in place in general, don't let the symbols be the thing that is the deciding factor whether you do or do not use that particular system, because of this whole conversation we're having about iconicity and about the complexity around it. There's a lot of factors that go into what makes an icon something that people understand. And so I would hate for someone to lose out on a system because you thought that the symbols were too complex or not complex enough,
Right. Sure. All of this stuff is, I mean, everything that we're talking about here is a construct of our own clinical interventions, right? And so I don't know if that makes sense, but I mean, all systems are abstract to one level or another. They're all going to have different challenges. And I agree with you that it should be a consideration, but there's a lot of other things to think about too. But I'm glad that we had this conversation, because this is it's something that's not really talked about. But to start this conversation and have people be more aware of it, I think is great, not only for the people that we serve, but also in order to get clinical feedback back to the people that are building these icon systems so that they can be improved. Because I think that often people will have opinions but not really comment about it. So all that being said, we do want to save a little bit of time to actually share Calum's interview with you. So without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Hartley in his interview about iconicity. Well, welcome back once again to Talking with Tech. As always, this is Lucas Stuber in not so sunny Portland, Oregon, as opposed to Rachel Madel, who's joining us from Los Angeles. How are you?
I'm doing really well. How are you guys doing?
I am thrilled today to be joined by Calum Hartley. How are you, sir?
I'm very well, thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Calum, if you could start us off, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Okay, so I'm a lecturer in psychology at Lancaster University in the UK. I'm predominantly, the research that I conduct focuses on communication and social cognition in children with ASD. I have a particular interest in children with profound language impairments, minimally verbal children. A lot of my existing research to date, because I'm an early career researcher, has investigated symbolic understanding of words, pictures, and how they represent objects. I'm currently interested in word learning.
Perfect. And just for people who don't know, that buzzword iconicity, can you just break that down for everybody?
So iconicity is a term that refers to essentially to what extent a symbol resembles the thing that it's intended to represent. And in terms of pictures, that iconicity is determined by visual properties, and it's like a spectrum. So at one end of the spectrum, you have images that share no perceptual similarities to the things they're meant to represent, your abstract art and your kind of children's scribbles, for example. And at the opposite end of the spectrum, you have things that look exactly like the thing they're meant to represent, really high resolution color photographs.
That's something that we think about a lot when we're working with kids using AAC, because, it's a visual language system. And the reason that I'm really excited to have you on and, to talk to you and pick your brain is because I'm really finding that my work with kids with autism, sometimes they're just not grasping these symbols. And the more abstract they are, the harder it is for them to learn. And then, obviously we need that receptive component, that comprehension in order to use these words. And I'm finding that the symbol does matter.
No, and it's great to hear that, because your experience is an applied practice. map on exactly to the kind of findings that we've discovered in our academic research. In a whole range of different experimental contexts, we found that iconicity definitely matters in terms of scaffolding how children understand pictures actually relate to the world. How they understand language relates to pictures and objects, and also their ability to mentally represent a picture and contextualize it in real world space.
Yeah, absolutely. And we also talk about core words versus fringe words, right? And the idea that core is not just nouns. So fringe is mostly nouns. And then core is obviously a little bit more abstract because it includes verbs and adjectives and prepositions. And those are really hard to encapsulate in an icon, right?
Yes.
It's really easy for apple. It looks like an apple, it is an apple, but for something like abstract.
Yeah, right. But draw a picture of love. This is where it gets challenging.
Exactly.
It is a real challenge. Yeah, representing verbs is tough, mainly because they involve dynamic action or something that doesn't tangibly, visibly exist, right? But that being said, I suspect there probably are ways of using iconicity to scaffold children's understanding of those kind of concepts in a way that is personally meaningful to them. And I wonder if use of photographs, particularly of the child, in engaging in these kinds of things might actually help.
I've seen that done a number of ways, but the problem that I have is that there's no one solution that I don't have a concern with, I guess. So using a photograph of the child engaged in an activity is very context dependent.
Yeah, of course.
And may not generalize as well for them into, like, say or a picture of them walking through the park may not translate to a picture of them walking Costco. And then there are some manufacturers that are moving more towards GIFs, but the sort of moving image piece, which I've also found can be distracting. So not to put you on the spot, but what's the solution? What do we do?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all solution. And I think it would probably be a case of transitional work. So it may well be the case that children who have particularly profound language difficulties, their route to figuring out how visual symbols, pictures relate to the world is only through perceptual similarity, is only through a high degree of iconicity. And it may be that you do need to start with those context-specific images and then transition potentially to using more generic images that serve, because of course you're right, absolutely. The beauty of a photograph is, of course, it can represent a very specific moment in time. It's contextualized. But that's not what pictures are all about. They're decontextualized for the most part. They serve a general referencing function. They represent categories of things. But it may be that perhaps that you need that initial context in order for the child to figure out how this thing that they're looking at actually maps onto reality.
A lot of times when I am working with a child who is using a device and they're not using it consistently, what I'll often do is I'll try to swap a photograph. So I always kind of start with icons because that's ideal, right? I always tell parents, we don't need every variety of cookie on this device if we can just have an icon for one cookie. Because there's the issue with AAC is we don't have the real estate. It's very laborious to have tons of folders with tons of vocabulary that children have to, scroll through and find. I don't love having, tons and tons and tons of different photos of the same thing. That's why the icon is so useful. But I think the problem is when a child's not grasping that concept, I'll try for the photograph. And I've worked with kids, and the moment you switch, they're not, say I'm working with food and toys, for example, and those are very, icon based, right? It's not just like, what toy do you choose for the photo of a toy? So what I'll do is I'll go and I'll just Google image something that has a bunch of toys, but it's a photograph. It's not a picture. And I've had kids literally go from so inconsistent to 100% accuracy, which shows me that they really understand when they see the photo of something, but they're not understanding the actual picture. So I think you're exactly right. We need to use that information, but also, kind of going off of what Lucas said, we don't want to get stuck there, right? Like we need to keep teaching and scaffolding and transitioning kids to eventually understanding icons. But I think from a short-term comprehension perspective, it's really, really useful to utilize photographs.
Well, it makes sense from a child development point of view. And we know from studies of early typical development that children who are kind of 18 to 24 months, they are far better at understanding how iconic color photos relate to the world than less iconic representations, whether that be in studies that involve picture books, for example, teaching them sequence of actions that they have to imitate, or being able to show them a picture of where a toy is hidden in a room and then them going on to find it. So we know that iconicity matters in early typical development, and then gradually it becomes less important as children's pictorial symbol system becomes less fragile. Now, if we think about the kind of building blocks of pictorial development in typical children, the foundations are often impaired, qualitatively atypical often in ASD. So it makes complete sense that for a longer period of time, they would be increasing a reliance on photographs and that having a greater degree of perceptual similarity.
Besides kind of utilizing photos, are there any, strategies that you think would be useful, or how do we transition a child who is not grasping those icons? What's kind of a systematic way to start introducing? Are there some icons that are easier than others, or do you have any hacks?
That's a good question. And again, this is my limitation being an academic psychologist as opposed to a practitioner like yourself. No, quite honest. My suspicion is that photographs are the way to go, but they still have their limitations. And like Lucas was pointing out, I think it's useful that a child might have that eureka moment and figure out, oh, I've been working with abstract icons for a while. Oh, I've seen a photo. I've worked this out. But really getting them to understand how it applies to not just their specific context, but more generally, there are strategies for that kind of thing, I suspect, particularly teaching using multiple exemplars.
That's one thing I remember from grad school. It might be the only thing I was ever taught about autism in grad school. Use multiple representations of words.
Yes.
Hey, where's your professors? Oh my gosh.
I could not agree more.
Well, and I think using it. So one comment that I made a statement about one benefit of the abstract symbols being, say, an abstract picture of a dog could stand in for all genus of dogs rather than a photo of the family dog, which may be harder to generalize. I guess if we start with the photographs, right, as Rachel articulated that she does often, what's the next step? How do we get here from there?
My perspective is that as children's communication and language improves, so we know that pictorial understanding in both typical development and there's emerging evidence in ASD that their understanding of how pictures relate to the world is tied into their understanding of verbal symbols. In typical development, we understand children usually understand what a verbal symbol means before they figure out a visual representation, how that actually relates to the world. So language is the most privileged symbol system there is, right? And parents and caregivers prioritize making sure children understand what these words mean. And if you think about all the common pictures that children tend to see early in development, they're all representative of words that are already in children's vocabularies for the most part. And there's studies out there that demonstrate that whilst that picture system is fragile for the child, they are absolutely reliant on using verbal scaffolding to figure out what the meaning of the picture actually is.
Do you think the more distinguishable the icon, the easier it is to sort of build that symbolic knowledge?
Well, shape is absolutely essential, both in terms of children's early lexical development and also how they figure out pictures, right? So children's early vocabulary, the kinds of words that they're learning are so well organized by shape that it actually attunes their attention to shape. And by once they've acquired about the estimates are between 50 and 150 count nouns in the vocabulary. That is the thing they pay attention to when they're learning new words, and they extend labels based on that. And once they figure out that the shape of something determines what it is, and therefore the name it should receive, they also apply that logic to pictures.
It goes to show you, how much this visual stimulus feeds our perception, not only of the world, but of language. Like, I mean, I know a lot of kids, for example, that cannot read McDonald's to save their life, but boy, will they recognize those arches.
Yes. So that's presumably a kind of reinforced relationship, right? They see the sign, and they get something good.
there's a little bit of operant conditioning going on there. I
think so.
This is a topic that's very interesting to me, and it's a topic that's of great interest, obviously, to the augmentative communication community, because this is one of the big questions, right? Is the ultimate goal of any of the students that we're working with is to get them to the point of literacy, right? To be able to read and to write, because that opens up a whole world of consumption and production that they wouldn't otherwise have. But that ability is predicated on so many different levels of symbolic knowledge. What's remarkable to me is that I'll have parents tell me, well, my child has no symbolic knowledge, right? But if they have any receptive language capability whatsoever, that implies to me that they do absolutely have symbolic knowledge. It may not be, it may not have developed typically in the form that we would sort of expect, but the foundation is all still there. Am I off base?
No. I think you're absolutely spot on. I mean, the purpose of symbolic communication is the transmission of referential intent, exactly as you were describing, both in terms of creating a picture, right? I mean, that's why iconicity is important, because the closer it looks like something it's meant to represent, the easier it is to figure that out and draw an inference from the vision of the visual properties of the thing to whatever object or concept, right? And the same is true with language. We put the sounds together with the idea of transmitting what's in our head, referential meaning. You're absolutely spot on. And
you had made reference to the concept of auditory iconicity, before we started recording. What did you mean by that?
So there's an emerging body of literature that indicates that natural language does have auditory iconicity. So in studies of artificial language, and we present kind of pseudo words that aren't real, but they have particular sounds, and we ask participants to just choose which of two things do they map onto, and there are reliable systematic preferences for a particular sounding word,
like Laurel and Heather, right? Is that where we're going with this?
So for example, like gloop. What would you imagine if I say gloop? What kind of shape do you think of?
I picture that Nickelodeon stuff that they drop on people in the 80s.
Something round, something amorphous, something with kind of soft edges, right? And then something like blot. I know blot's an actual word, but imagine it isn't. Jot. What kind of a shape would you think there?
It feels sharper to me.
Exactly, right? And that's the kind of preference that is reliable, always comes out in these kinds of experiments, that there are certain sounds that conjure these kind of conceptual perceptions over kind of sharp things, round things, and those sounds reliably map onto how language actually works, real languages.
I was just going to say, I'm just thinking about, like you said, blot or jot, and that I feel like it goes with the fact that, that's a stop. That T is t, and that makes me think of like hard edges, right? And that ooh sound is more like flowing. And yeah, that's so fascinating. I'm really interested by that.
Yeah, and the way in which language is structured, it has a grammar to it. And children are super sensitive to the way in which function words, determiners, how nouns, how they logically fit together in a reliable way. And by being sensitive to that grammar, it actually facilitates their acquisition of the language.
Now, do we find consistency in that research, or if across different cultures, across different, like I, for example, in my own AAC development, we encountered certain cultures where we had to flip all the icons right to left, right, in order for them to be interpreted, in the manner that was expected. It seems to me that there would be certain preconceptions within each language, but I'm sort of making that up as I say it. So.
I suspect you're probably right, because we know, from a super early age, children's perceptual tuning to the language that they hear, their native language, it refines as early as 6 months, and certainly going on to 12 months. Because, of course, the infants are born with a really blank slate in terms of their ability to discriminate the sounds in which they hear. But as they hear more and more of the sounds of their native language, their auditory system tunes itself to really to focus on discriminating the sounds that are prevalent in their language. And that's actually a characteristic that's prevalent in ASD, or rather it's not prevalent. You get children with ASD and adults with ASD that have really, really sensitive auditory tuning. and are super sensitive to pitch and don't show that kind of preference to native sounds.
How interesting. Because I know I've read studies of infants that are able to identify even their mother's accent, let alone their mother's voice specifically. This is why I was so excited about this conversation, because I am at my core a practitioner. So I read the research, and I'm a reasonable consumer of research, but to be able to speak with you about this, this very hot topic is fascinating. So, one of the hot debates then is the concept of the importance of symbolic knowledge, or, of iconicity relative to motor planning, right? So, and maybe we could even go as extreme as someone who was born, without sight, right? Maybe they would never acquire the symbolic knowledge, but certainly they could acquire language. How do we reconcile those facts?
Well, the understanding that you can use something, whatever kind of symbol it is, to represent and transmit meaning about something else to other members of our culture is absolutely fundamental to communication. And if you don't have that referential insight, then what are you doing? At most, you're using symbols, not symbols, but as signs. So you're learning that, let's go back to pictures. That's why I know. If you hand over a picture of a toy or your favorite snack, then that leads to someone's behavior. It manipulates their behavior. They respond in a way that's favorable, and it leads to the child obtaining something that they want. Now, they might get that through association and repetition and scaffolding, but they don't necessarily ever have to understand the representational relation between the symbol and the outcome.
So, and then based also on the comment that you made about infants having a blank slate, could we make the argument that symbolic knowledge is conditioned?
Oh, that's an interesting one, because symbolic communication is, it's born out of a whole bunch of things. Now, one theory is that infants, typically developing infants, are born with an innate desire to communicate and an innate desire to share cognitive and social space with others.
Yeah, and to impact their environment.
Exactly, right? And that's why they maintain eye contact from day one. They imitate, they pull faces, they engage in joint attention and all of that good stuff. Those are quality or behaviors that are often absent or atypical in ASD. And a prominent contemporary theory of autism is this lack of social motivation. So their innate drive to communicate with others, that might be one factor that's missing, that is actually a building block of symbolic representational knowledge. The desire to fundamentally communicate meaning to others and to understand other people are trying to communicate with me.
If you're not motivated to do so, then why acquire that knowledge?
That's right. And symbol systems are cultural conventions, right? They differ across all the different countries in the world. You learn a language that is specific to whatever is being spoken wherever you're born, right? Someone isn't born with English or French or German, right? They're born with an innate capacity to acquire language, but the nature of that language depends on where you are. And pictures, they're exactly the same. There are studies, cross-cultural studies out there that show the age of understanding symbolic nature of pictures depends entirely on the amount of exposure that children actually receive to these things. So if you're not motivated to engage in interactions and pay attention to the way in which others are behaving towards you with pictures, that they're trying to communicate this knowledge, then you're going to have difficulty inferring that representational intent.
Well, so what I was going to say is I feel like exactly what you just said, Calum, ties in to kind of a more practical realization that motivation is sometimes missing with autism. And, in order to teach that, we need the motivation. Mm-hmm. So something that I was kind of thinking about as I asked you, a practical question for implementation, how do we get kids to, where we need them to be for iconicity? I think one of the key components is using their most motivated vocabulary.
Yes.
So, if they really, a lot of the kids that I work with are just like obsessed with snacks. So, finding an icon for one of their snacks, is something that we can start with because that motivation is there. That's kind of a fundamental piece that we need. Sure, we can use photographs on the system, but I definitely want to keep teaching iconicity. I don't want to just convert every symbol to a photograph. First of all, very hard. But also I want to make sure we're teaching those skills. Maybe for short-term success, we can change a lot of the icons to photos, but for those really highly desired ones, making sure that we keep those icons
I think you're absolutely right. Using those positive reinforcers, the kind of things that the children are super motivated to communicate with you about, at the very least instrumentally, is a vital starting point. And it may be that by using those really motivational items, you might start with a photo, but then you could easily turn it into a color line drawing. You just trace around the outline, color it in, and then you can transition to making it a black and white line drawing.
Great idea.
Child's already got this notion that this 2D image can stand for this 3D thing that I'm really like. But what you're doing is you're changing the iconicity of the image, but they still have that foundational knowledge of how this image relates to the world. Is
there a progression? I know developmentally with children there is a progression how they learn iconicity. Is that different for kids with autism?
I don't think it is. I just think the trajectory and the timing is different. So typical kids, they transition really, really quickly, right? But they have all of the ingredients necessary to facilitate pictorial development. And it may be that some of those ingredients, language and, the ability to infer representational intent, they're not always there in ASD. So it may be that they have to rely on highly transparent symbols for a bit longer. But there's no reason to think that they couldn't eventually get there. As language develops or as the training progresses, you build on a concept that they understand. There's no reason why you couldn't shift different levels of iconicity. And certainly one of our studies indicates that using a color image is probably more important than necessarily whether it's a photograph or a line drawing. So in one of our studies where we looked at the children's ability to extend words that they've mapped onto pictures, onto objects, as we do all the time in how we learn from pictures, we found that there was real similarity in their understanding of color pictures, of color line drawings and color photos was much higher, twice as good as black and white line drawings and grayscale photos, which were much worse, but very similar to each other.
That's really interesting and something to think about when, we're looking at the icons and, in AAC devices, there's lots of different symbol sets.
So, and you brought up an interesting point. So, because we do have some research, right, in iconicity over the years. And so one of the ones that just came to mind as you brought this up is the Fitzgerald Key, right? The color coding component, which has always been a challenge for me because I'm on the extreme end of colorblind. So I have to ask families often to take care of that for me.
Can we define what Fitzgerald Key is for our listeners who don't know?
Sure. So the Fitzgerald Key was a piece of research, I believe, in the 70s, if I'm not right. We'll have this in the show notes, and if I'm wrong, I'll apologize 10 or 12 times. But the idea being that certain colors could represent certain forms of speech, right? Or excuse me, forms of words. So verbs should be colored in a certain way, prepositions in a certain way, nouns in a certain way, pronouns in a different way. There's a chicken or the egg thing there. Are we doing that because we want to reinforce those colors to aid acquisition, or is there a reason why we chose those colors?
That's an interesting question that, to be honest, I haven't necessarily got an answer for, but I suspect it might matter. Pairing. So we know that children with ASD are very, very visual, right? And they have hypersensitivity across all different modalities, including vision. And there is research that shows that they are hypersensitive to color. It is very, very attention grabbing. So by presenting a concept, whether it's a word alongside a color, it could potentially serve as a tag and help them organize their conceptual knowledge, for sure. I wouldn't see that necessarily as a bad thing, given that we know that children with ASD can have differences in terms of their categorization, particularly lexical categorization, and the degree to which they pay attention to shape versus color is often, it's the research indicates that it's unusual.
Yeah, and I think that, a lot of the AAC systems, most of them, you're able to do that color coding and do, either a Fitzgerald key or a modified Fitzgerald key. So I think, as far as I'm concerned, why not? We don't know, we don't have the definitive research to tell us one way, but intuitively it makes sense as, an additional layer of, aiding in that comprehension of categories and understanding. And it's not always as important in the beginning, stages of language development for kids with autism, but, definitely down the line. I do a lot of stuff with color coding with my systems. And then I also have a lot of visual supports that I use, in order to eventually work on WH questions and, who is the same color as the pronouns. So it's just kind of making those connections for kids who are very visual, I think is just a really good practice.
I think that's the kind of thing I was getting at, really, in terms of helping, and just another way in which they can organize knowledge about the world. If you're a child with autism and your understanding and perception of the world is somewhat chaotic, then adding these additional regularities, it can only be a positive thing in terms of bringing order to their thoughts and understanding of how things work.
Yeah, well, I think the only, you asked why not to do it, and the situations I can think of really would be cortical visual impairment, right? So CVI, where, high contrast is critical. And then I do often wonder, this goes back to the GIF piece for verbs. I'm always conscious of attention theft. And we think about this even with fonts with dyslexia, right? That there can be confounding variables in the way that we present information that may not occur to us.
And to be honest, I think that dynamic visual movement, that's a strength and limitation, particularly with this new explosion of digital technology in AAC. Again, that's something that all the research indicates is a real strength. They love the movement, they love the dynamic integration, and that is far more motivational in the intervention studies than often your more traditional types of AAC.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about where we could go with that, right? And this idea of encapsulating, it doesn't have to be a static image anymore. And so I've tried to do a little bit of this in my own practice. And I definitely know it's more motivating. We take a video of a kid jumping and then we pull that image and put it on their device and they love it. I do often wonder, is this more distracting or is this actually solidifying? It's definitely fun. So there's that.
And there are some eye gaze heat map studies that show dramatically different means of consumption of those video models from neurotypical kids relative to children with autism. I see Calum nodding here, so maybe you have.
Yeah. Those kind of differences in patterns of attention are super common, and particularly regarding social stimuli. And I suppose using video adds another level to that iconicity spectrum, the continuum I was referring to at the very start, right? If you see something moving and that thing is you performing the very action I'm trying to, represent, then that's perfect, really, and could really enhance children's understanding if you then take an image and it's clear. But yeah, certainly in terms of the use of digital technologies to promote communication, the jury is somewhat out currently in the literature. The most common finding is that kids find it super engaging and super motivational, and parents love it too. But in terms of actual generalized communicative skills in real world contexts, it doesn't the evidence indicates that it's not detrimental, it's no worse, but it's no better.
Which reminds me of the visual scene display devices that are incredibly salient at home in the kitchen when you want to point to what's in the counter. But, again, when you go to Costco, you don't have a picture for that.
Yeah, there's a really interesting study that kind of touches on that. Sue Fletcher-Watson in the UK designed an app that essentially the kids had it for 2 months, and it was meant to teach social communication skills. So they had a picture of a person in the middle of the screen, and the avatar would look in different corners of the screen at different things, and the child had to follow their gaze, had to follow points, very social communicative cues. And the kids were ace at it by the end of the study. They got really, really good and could complete all the levels. But when their social and linguistic skills are actually tested outside using standardized tests, there was no tangible improvements. So it's again this issue that we were mentioning before about generalizing across context really challenges transitioning, I suppose.
I think there's a broader joke to be made there about standardized testing in general.
Very true. And also just kind of going off of that, I think that's where I'm really interested in virtual reality and how that could potentially help with that. We know that's the missing piece, right? Where kids aren't generalizing these skills. It's the hardest thing, especially for kids with autism. I think the closer we are to real world contexts, the better off we are. But still, it's still only limited. So, at some level, it's still, we go back to the, contextualize versus decontextualize. And I think it's a balance, right? I don't think it's one way or the other. I think that we kind of need to take every child's individual differences and then figure out what makes sense for them. And also balancing that with continuing to teach them and expand beyond, if they're not understanding icons, kind of expanding beyond that.
If you were asked, like, okay, design an iconicity system for a new AAC device, like, where would you begin?
A really interesting question. I think I've been looking for certain features, of course, in terms of the qualities of the app, of course. I'd want it to be customizable. I'd want the option to be able to take photos if needed and input them into the kind of gallery of pictures that a child could use. I'd want to make sure that it didn't require any real fine motor controls. I'd want to make sure that it could be easily manipulated using big buttons and big kind of finger and palm swipes. I wouldn't want it to be fiddly. And really, ideally before I released it, I want some empirical support. There's as you mentioned, there are so many apps out there, right? That are available for parents and practitioners to download and use. Do we know how many of them are actually supported by research?
I can think of one off the top of my head. And for those of you that are developers listening, there's more than that. I know I'm being a little facetious, but I can think of one for sure.
Exactly, right? But you can rest assured that there are probably tens of thousands of apps out there that are designed or sold or pitched with the intention of facilitating communicative development and language acquisition and children's interpersonal communication. And what they can base that claim on is, well, not a whole lot, really. And there is a website, Autism Speaks, the charity that funds a lot of ASD research in the States. On their website, there is a database of apps, and you can search by ones that have got empirical support. The problem is, I suppose, quite a few of the ones that do are quite costly, which is the downside if you're a parent, potentially. The other thing I've just thought of is if one of the objectives of the app was to promote vocabulary development or lexical development, it would need to provide the optimal conditions for children to learn, and therefore it needs to be informed by the research how we know the effective ways that even minimally verbal children can figure out what words mean. It would need to be based on those kinds of strategies.
What, if anything, would you like to share that we didn't ask about?
Well, I'm very grateful, of course, to be invited to be on the podcast. As I alluded to before, my funded research at the moment, I'm exploring pathways for word learning. Why it is that some children have difficulties in identifying, retaining, and generalizing meaning, both in terms of learning in fast mapping, which is learning names in the moment that they're heard, and cross-situational learning, which is mapping words to context over time. I'm doing a big project at the moment exploring how these mechanisms are atypical in ASD. So I look forward to hopefully sharing that with you soon.
We would love to have you back on the show.
Well, again, my name is Lucas Stuber, along with Rachel Madel, joined by Calum Hartley for Talking with Tech. Please do check our show notes, which you can find on iTunes for anything that we talked about today, Fitzgerald Key, these other things. We'll have links in there, as well as, of course, to Dr. Hartley's research. We appreciate you listening. Any feedback at all that you have, please direct to tech@speechscience.org or our Facebook page, which is also called Talking with Tech. And if you have questions for Calum, we'll be happy to pass them along. All right. Well, thanks so much to Calum for joining us. I thought that was a really informative interview about a topic that we need to be talking more about. So I'm really glad that he joined us.
If you guys haven't already, please join our Facebook group. Just search Talking with Tech. We have tons of conversations in there after the episodes, and we would love to hear from you. So please join our group.
And if you go to your podcasting app and you find us in that podcasting app, you'll see that there's a place where you can hit subscribe. That subscribe button is how you don't miss any future episodes. And there's a place where you can actually rate us as well. And that would be awesome if you gave some ratings or feedback or write a quick review. That really helps us out. So we really appreciate it.
Well, once again, for Talking with Tech, this has been Lucas Stuber, Rachel Madel, and Chris Begay. We'll talk to y'all next week.